The first light of morning drifted across the canvas walls of the field hospital, soft and pale, as if hesitant to touch a place so full of wounded breath. The cold clung to everything: metal trays, damp earth, the sleeves of uniforms stiff with overnight frost. Smoke from distant shell fires moved lazily through the air, blending with the faint scent of antiseptic, creating a strange quiet that felt almost suspended in time. Nothing was fully still, but nothing rushed either. It was the kind of moment where every sound seemed softened, as though the world were speaking in whispers. A lone lantern swayed gently from a wooden beam, its dim glow fading as dawn tried to take its place. Medics walked with measured steps, their boots pressing into the mud with a slow, almost rhythmic certainty. They spoke in low tones, trading nods more than words, their faces lined with fatigue, yet holding a steady calm. Outside, a stretcher creaked as someone adjusted its straps, and from somewhere deeper in the tent came a quiet groan, muffled by bandages and exhaustion. This fragile stillness wrapped the scene like a thin blanket, inviting the viewer into a world where every breath counted, and where morning arrived not with triumph, but with gentle persistence.
Inside the tent, the American medical teams moved with a steady purpose that felt almost like a quiet ritual. They checked instruments laid out on small folding tables, each piece catching the early light with a muted glint. One nurse tightened the straps on a canvas cot, giving it a firm shake before nodding to herself. Another rolled up her sleeves, exposing arms marked by long nights and countless emergencies, yet her movements remained smooth and sure. A surgeon warmed his hands near a small stove, rubbing them together slowly, not out of haste, but from the knowledge that warm hands made steadier work. Their conversation floated through the space in soft fragments, updates on supplies, gentle reminders, small acknowledgments that kept the team aligned. There was no panic here, only practiced readiness, as if they had learned to meet chaos with a kind of disciplined grace. Even in their fatigue, there was an unmistakable steadiness, the kind that reassured anyone watching that these were people who would not falter, no matter what came through the flaps of the tent. Their calm competence shaped the atmosphere, turning the uncertain morning into something quietly dependable. The first stretchers arrived just as the sun began to lift above the distant ridge, carried by medics whose breaths rose in faint clouds. The flaps of the tent opened to reveal a line of wounded men, some in familiar American uniforms, others in torn and muddied German gray. For a moment the contrast was startling. Neighboring cots, their boots dangling over the edges, their faces marked by the same shades of fear and pain. A young American soldier clutched his shoulder, eyes half closed, while beside him a German corporal trembled from blood loss, whispering something no one around him understood. The doctors, among them was a young infantryman who couldn't have been more than 19, his helmet sitting crooked on his head, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the camp, as if still trying to understand how quickly the front had swallowed his world. Next to him, an older sergeant limped forward, jaw clenched, not out of defiance, but simply to keep himself upright. Every few steps he blinked hard, fighting back the shock of finding himself on the losing side of a battle he once believed Germany would win. Their boots dragged softly across the frozen ground, creating a faint, collective shuffle that carried the weight of surrender. Yet beneath the grime and exhaustion, there was something fragile about them, something unmistakably human. They looked less like the imagined enemy and more like men who had reached the limits of what a body and spirit could endure. Many of the prisoners carried a quiet, tightening fear that clung to them more stubbornly than the dirt on their uniforms. They had heard stories, whispered at campfires or murmured by officers, of what might await them if captured by Americans. Some believed they would be beaten, others that they would be left to die slowly from unattended wounds. A few expected humiliation, imagining every harsh tale they had been taught since their earliest days in uniform suddenly coming true. As they stepped closer to the hospital tents, that fear deepened. Every unfamiliar sound seemed to confirm their worst expectations. The clatter of metal trays made one man flinch violently. Another kept his eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that a single glance might be taken as insolence. Even the simplest gestures from the guards, pointing, guiding, urging them forward, felt loaded, their meaning twisted by the prisoners' own uncertainty. They had lost control of their fate, and in the quiet moments between footsteps, each imagined what punishment might follow. It was a fragile psychology, fragile enough that even kindness could feel like a trap. And yet, as they approached the first row of cots, the world they feared was not the one waiting for them.
They stepped inside, expecting harsh voices or cold indifference, but instead found a scene so unfamiliar it halted them in place. On the closest row of cots lay a wounded American soldier, his face pale beneath a smear of dried blood. Just inches away, on the next cot, a German private lay trembling under a blanket, his uniform cut open, bandages already wrapped around his chest. An American doctor knelt between them, moving from one to the other with the same calm focus, adjusting a dressing here, checking a pulse there, his expression unchanged by the difference in uniforms. A nurse passed by carrying a basin of warm water, pausing only long enough to tuck a blanket more securely around the German's shoulders, before turning to soothe the American's labored breathing. Nothing about their movements suggested hierarchy or rank.
Vengeance. It was as if the battlefield outside had been replaced by a fragile pocket of neutrality. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances, struggling to understand what they were seeing. Enemies were supposed to be kept apart. Wounds were supposed to deepen the divide. Yet here, under the soft glow of lantern light, suffering was treated as a shared human burden, and compassion flowed without regard for allegiance. Long before these doctors ever stepped onto a battlefield, they had been shaped by lecture halls that smelled of chalk and sterilant, by long nights spent studying anatomy under dim lamps, and by mentors who spoke softly about duty even when the world shouted about war. They carried with them an oath that did not bend to borders, a promise to protect life wherever it appeared, and whatever uniform it wore. In training camps far from the front, they practiced under tents much like these, learning how to stitch torn muscle, how to calm a fading pulse, how to steady their own hands even when their hearts raced. Their instructors reminded them that war had its own brutal logic, but medicine must not follow it. Saving a life was not an act of alliance. It was an act of humanity. By the time these men and women reached the front lines, their moral compass had been reinforced through repetition and reflection, becoming something they could rely on more than the rumble of distant artillery. As they worked, they drew on that quiet foundation, a grounding belief that healing was its own form of resistance against the destruction unfolding around them.
When the wounded came in waves, the medics often gathered for a brief, urgent exchange, a few seconds where decisions had to be made with absolute clarity. A lieutenant spread a rough chart across a crate, marking each patient's condition with quick pencil strokes. One man gasped for breath, another bled steadily from a leg wound, a third drifted in and out of consciousness. Their uniforms varied, but the conversation never touched on insignias. Instead, it circled around blood loss, airway obstruction, and the precious minutes that remained for each.
A young medic hesitated once, glancing between a severely wounded German and a less critical American soldier he instinctively wanted to help first. The senior doctor shook his head gently, not in reprimand, but in reminder. "We treat the worst off first," he said, his voice calm, almost tender despite the urgency. "That's the rule, always." The others nodded, falling back into a rhythm forged by training and conviction. When they moved together, carrying stretchers, preparing splints, administering morphine, bound by a moral code stronger than instinct or allegiance. In those moments, the tension of the battlefield.
The operating tent had grown unusually still, the kind of hush that settled only when everyone understood how fragile the next few minutes would be. A young German soldier lay on the table, skin drained of color, breath hitching softly as the anesthetic mask was lowered over his face. His fingers twitched against the metal edge, searching for something familiar in a place where nothing felt safe. An American medic stepped closer, his gloves already dusted with drying antiseptic, and gently took the young man's hand in his own. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, yet it carried a warmth that cut through the cold air. The soldier's grip tightened for a heartbeat, as though anchoring himself to the only steady thing he could sense. The medic didn't speak. He simply stayed there, thumb brushing once against the back of the trembling hand, offering a presence that words would only disturb. Around them, instruments clinked softly, and the surgeon prepared his first incision, but that quiet moment held a different kind of gravity. It was a reminder that even here, at the edge of life and loss, human comfort could cross any boundary, easing fear with something as simple as a held hand.
They gathered in small clusters near the edge of the tent, wrapped in blankets that still carried the smell of smoke and damp earth. Their voices rose only in hushed fragments, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever strange balance held this place together. Some of the German POWs leaned close, eyes darting toward the rows of cots where their wounded comrades lay beside American soldiers, still struggling to understand what they had witnessed. They whispered about the care they'd seen, the steady hands, the soft words, the blankets tucked with unexpected gentleness. It clashed sharply with the stories that had shaped them since childhood, tales of Americans painted as crude, selfish, even cruel. One man recalled lessons drilled into him at school, images of enemy nations drawn in harsh, simple lines. Another murmured about speeches they had heard at rallies, each promising that no mercy would come from the other side. Now, standing in the dim light of a hospital tent where compassion moved freely between uniforms, those old lessons felt strangely brittle. They looked at one another, searching for explanations that no one seemed able to give. The world, they realized, was not unfolding as they had been taught.
The gratitude appeared first as a flicker, almost too small to notice. A young German soldier, his arm wrapped tightly in fresh bandages, lay propped against a stack of folded blankets. His breathing was shallow, but steadier than the night before. An American nurse approached with a cup of warm broth, moving with the same gentle patience she gave every patient, no matter the color of their uniform. She guided the cup to his lips, waiting as he took small, careful sips. Her touch was efficient, yet soft, the sort of care that required no translation. When she turned to leave, the soldier hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached toward her sleeve. His voice cracked from disuse and pain, but the words slipped out clearly enough to stop her mid-step. "Danke," he whispered,
almost apologetically, as if unsure he was allowed to speak it aloud. The nurse paused, surprised for only a moment, before offering a warm, brief smile in return. She nodded, not needing to say anything more. Around them, the quiet of the tent seemed to deepen, as though acknowledging the small bridge that had just been built, fragile, hesitant, but unmistakably real.
In the hours that followed, something almost imperceptible began to settle over the German prisoners. A softening, like frost melting along the edges of a window pane. The sharp fear that had shadowed their every movement now loosened its grip, replaced by a cautious, unfamiliar sense of safety. They watched the doctors and nurses move from cot to cot, offering the same measured attention, regardless of accent or insignia. And with each passing moment, the idea of the enemy grew harder to fit back into the rigid shapes they had carried into the war. A few of them shifted to make space for American soldiers resting nearby, no longer flinching at their presence. Others accepted water or blankets without the stiff tension that had marked their first hours in captivity. Their conversations changed tone as well, less frantic, more reflective, as if they were sifting through the remnants of beliefs that no longer held. Some spoke of families back home, of work they hoped to return to, of a life beyond orders and marching drills. The war hadn't ended for them, not yet, but in this quiet corner of the front, it felt momentarily distant, softened by the steady hands that cared for both sides without hesitation. And in that fragile calm, new questions began to take shape. Questions about loyalty, humanity, and the boundaries they thought could never blur.
The bombardment began as a low, distant rumble, a kind of rolling thunder that vibrated through the canvas walls before anyone fully registered the sound. The doctors didn't stop. They simply lifted their heads for a heartbeat, gauging the distance the way seasoned medics did, then returned to their work with steady hands. Outside, the ground shuddered as another shell landed somewhere beyond the trees, sending a brief flicker through the lanterns hanging overhead. Their light swayed across the operating tables, casting soft, trembling shadows that moved like restless spirits along the walls. Instruments rattled faintly in their trays, yet the room remained surprisingly calm, held together by a shared understanding that the wounded couldn't wait for quiet skies. A surgeon leaned forward, his voice low and even, as he asked for the next clamp, the request floating through the tension like a familiar note in an old song. Nurses adjusted their footing, bracing themselves as another blast trembled through the earth, but their movements never lost their careful precision. Even the patients sensed the strange blend of chaos and control, some drifting in and out of consciousness to the rhythm of distant fire. The war raged only yards away, yet inside the ward, the air held a fragile order, as though compassion itself was creating a small, stubborn pocket of peace amid the noise.
2 tables stood side by side, separated only by a narrow strip of canvas and the hurried footsteps of the staff. On one lay an American infantryman, his uniform cut away to reveal a deep wound along his rib cage. On the other, a German soldier of similar age lay pale and motionless, his breath shallow beneath the oxygen mask. The surgeons moved between them with a rhythm carved from countless emergencies, their gloved hands passing seamlessly from one patient to the next. A nurse sponged blood from the American side, then turned without hesitation to adjust the German's IV line, her touch identical in its steadiness. The doctor overseeing both cases kept his tone calm, issuing gentle instructions that floated through the dim light, never rising with the urgency of the moment. To anyone watching, the scene carried a quiet intimacy. Two enemies lying inches apart, their fates now held in the same practiced hands. The war outside roared and shook the earth, but here inside the ward, the boundaries drawn by nations had dissolved into something simpler. Saving one life did not diminish the other. Instead, each act of care reinforced a truth the battlefield could not erase.
Later, when the ward had quieted and the worst of the shelling had drifted away, one of the nurses spoke softly about moments she'd witnessed during operations, moments so small they seemed almost secret. She described how under the haze of anesthesia, soldiers sometimes reached blindly into the space beside them, their hands searching for something familiar in the darkness behind their eyelids. More than once, she had seen an American hand slip toward the edge of a cot and brush lightly against the fingers of a wounded German, lying only inches away. Sometimes, the German's hand twitched in response, as if recognizing another human presence, even through layers of pain and sedation. There was no awareness in these movements, no conscious gesture of unity, just an instinctive reaching out born from fear and vulnerability. The nurse never interfered unless it threatened a line or dressing. Instead, she let those fleeting contacts linger for a heartbeat before the unconscious search softened into stillness again. To her, these were some of the most human moments in the ward, tiny, fragile reminders that beneath the weight of uniforms and war, the need for connection remained the same. And in those brief touches, the distance between enemies seemed to fade, if only for the length of a dream.
In the quieter hours of recovery, when the lanterns burned low and footsteps in the ward softened to a gentle shuffle, many of the wounded turned to the simplest form of expression they still had strength for: writing. Pages were torn from notebooks, or scavenged from supply crates, or offered by nurses who understood the comfort a blank sheet could bring. Some soldiers rested the paper against their knees, others used the edges of their cots, their hands trembling as they guided pencils worn down to stubs. The American wounded wrote first about home, porches they hoped to sit on again, fields waiting to be plowed, children who had grown taller since their last letters. The German POWs wrote in smaller, tighter script, as though trying not to disturb the fragile calm around them. They wrote to mothers and sweethearts, to brothers still on distant fronts, to fathers they hoped were safe. These letters carried pieces of their inner worlds: fear, longing, gratitude, and the quiet hope that the war's shadow might one day lift. Even those who struggled to form words found comfort in simply trying, letting their thoughts settle onto the page. In those moments, the ward felt less like a battlefield refuge, and more like a shared room of souls reaching homeward through ink and memory.
Some of the letters carried a quiet, trembling gratitude, woven into sentences that seemed to breathe with relief. An American private wrote that he hadn't expected to feel safe again so soon, thanking the nurses whose steady hands had guided him through the fog of pain. A German corporal, his handwriting uneven from a splinted wrist, described the bewildering kindness he'd received from the very people he had been taught to fear. Others confessed to a deeper, more lingering dread, the fear of being sent back to the front once their bodies were patched enough to stand. They wrote of nights waking to distant gunfire in their dreams, of wondering whether their strength would ever match the demands of war again. Yet threaded through all of it was a longing so simple it almost hurt to read: the desire to go home. They pictured small kitchens, familiar paths through fields, the sound of a loved one calling from another room. Even those likely to remain prisoners for the rest of the conflict clung to these images as guides through the uncertainty ahead. Though their uniforms and languages differed, the letters echoed one another with the same yearning for safety, for reunion, for a life untouched by the memories that haunted them now. Many of these letters never found their way beyond the canvas walls of the ward. Some were tucked under pillows, forgotten when the writer was moved to another tent. Others slipped between crates.
Staff later gathered belongings to clear the space. They often found these folded pages resting like small, forgotten relics of private worlds. Reading them felt like opening windows into moments too fragile to survive the chaos outside. Confessions of fear, promises to return, simple notes of thanks addressed to people who would never see them. The war shifted constantly, carrying their authors in unpredictable directions, and the letters remained where they had been written, suspended in time. Yet even in their stillness, they held something enduring, a reminder that behind every uniform was a person reaching outward, trying to be heard. The words stayed, even when the voices moved on, filling the tent with a quiet longing that lingered long after the pages were lifted away. When the war finally loosened its grip and the steady thunder of artillery faded into memory, the field hospital seemed to exhale for the first time in years. Reports traveled faster than the wind, ceasefires declared, fronts collapsing, orders shifting from attack to retreat, and at last to release. Word reached the German POWs slowly, carried in cautious whispers from guard to guard, until it spread through the tents like a soft, disbelieving tide. Many of the prisoners sat in stunned silence, unsure how to process a freedom they had stopped imagining. Those strong enough to stand gathered their few belongings with trembling hands, folding blankets and slipping worn letters into their coats, unsure whether the lives they were returning to still waited for them.
The American staff watched with a mix of relief and quiet ache. They had come to know these men, not as enemies, but as patients. Faces they had tended through fevered nights, voices they had soothed during moments of terror. Now they stood by as the prisoners lined up to be repatriated, their expressions shadowed by a strange combination of hope and fear. Outside, the air was unusually still, touched by the early warmth of a peaceful dawn. As the men began their slow walk away from the camp, there was no cheering, no dramatic farewell, only a series of quiet nods exchanged between those who had once faced each other across battle lines. It felt less like an ending and more like a fragile passing into the unknown. Years later, when former POWs were asked about their time in captivity, many spoke not of fear or humiliation, but of the moments in the hospital that had quietly reshaped their understanding of the world. One recalled lying on a cot with a fever so high he drifted in and out of consciousness, waking each time to the same American doctor checking his pulse with a patience he could not comprehend. Another remembered a nurse who stayed at his bedside through a long night of bleeding, humming a tune he didn't recognize but found strangely comforting.
What struck them most was how effortlessly the medical teams set aside the identities that war had carved into them. They discovered that the people they had been told to fear could be steady, gentle, even selfless in ways that caught them off guard. Many admitted that those hours in the ward had been the first time they questioned the stories they had been raised on, the first time they felt the truth of a simple, disarming idea: an enemy can still choose to save your life. The hospital stood quiet now, its canvas walls faded by months of sun and rain, the once bustling pathways softened back into ordinary earth.
At dawn, the same pale light that had once revealed rows of wounded now slipped gently across empty cots, illuminating the impressions left behind by bodies long departed. The lantern swayed lightly in the morning breeze, no longer fighting the darkness, but simply moving with the air, their glass no longer smudged by hurried hands. Instruments that once rang with urgent clatter had been packed away, leaving only the faint smell of metal and antiseptic, lingering like a memory. Outside, the ground that had trembled with shellfire felt strangely steady, as if the land itself were relearning how to be still. The distant horizon, once blurred by smoke, opened into a soft, unbroken stretch of sky. A few stray papers rustled near an abandoned crate, a reminder of letters that had never found their way home, of voices that had filled these tents with longing and hope. In this quiet, it became easy to imagine the people who had passed through. Soldiers, nurses, prisoners, doctors. Their footsteps had faded, but the human traces they left behind seemed woven into the silence itself, warm and enduring.